Hello there. Welcome to the second episode of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. My name is Sian Esther Powell. I'm currently doing my Masters in Celtic Studies, so whilst I'm by no means an expert quite yet, I do have a very particular interest in this area of study, and it's something that I am quite familiar with in many ways. So the first episode of the podcast was on the Cornish pixie, which is of course a folkloric creature. So I had actually recorded almost a complete episode on the topic of banshees, but the more I thought about it, the more I didn't actually want to upload another episode based on folkloric creatures right after the first one had done the same thing. So I'm trying to juggle around what kind of things I talk about, because of course I want to cover not only various folkloric creatures, but also the folk tales themselves and mythology. So I really want to cover all bases as it pertains to Celtic history and Celtic mythology. Of course, this is based on folklore and mythology, and I won't really be going too deep into Celtic history because, of course, there was no united Celtic nation. And what I mean when I say Celtic is anything pertaining to the myths and legends of what we now know of as the 6 Celtic nations. And of course those are Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, Isle of Man and Cornwall. So the reason it's taken me so long to upload this second episode is because I've been quite dug into my studies, and something I've studied in quite a lot of depth, and I've really loved it, and it's absolutely fantastic, and I can't wait to share it, is the Mabinogion. So this episode might be quite short. I'm not exactly sure how long it's going to take me to really record. So I'm going to probably record 4 episodes on the Mabinogion, and I'll explain a little bit more why that is. But firstly, I want to say thank you so much to everyone who has given me feedback on episode 1. I know some people thought the music was too loud, so I'm going to try and lower the volume of the music significantly in this episode, because this episode really is going to rely on storytelling. So hopefully my voice can carry me through, otherwise I'm not a very good storyteller. I suppose I should probably mention what exactly the Mabinogion is. So, the Mabinogion is the first prose tales of Britain. So these were tales that were compiled in Middle Welsh in the 12th and 13th centuries. So they're incredibly old, and the stories themselves, whilst they were written down in the medieval period, are actually set in a distant past, a distant Wales. So the Wales at the time it's set in the stories is divided into various kingdoms of including Gwynedd and Dyfed and Powys in the middle. So the Mabinogion is a collection of tales, and specifically I'm going to be talking about the 4 branches of the Mabinogion. So the way that they would have been first created is part of oral history and oral storytelling. They were written down in the medieval period, but they would have been based on oral history that would have been alive for many, many years in Wales. So these are stories that would have been likely well known. So we have our grand mythology that we think of, Greek mythology and everything like this. So when we read the stories, it would have been relying on the audience knowing quite a bit of context of the world. And when you read the book, it's quite interesting because obviously it's not written like a standard novel or standard prose, because whilst it is prose and whilst it is literature, it's also myth and legend as well, and its original form was oral performance. It's worth pointing out the first modern English translations were by William Owen Pugh in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and they were included in various journals. But the first complete compilation written in English was by Lady Charlotte Guest, which is, it's really brilliant, and it really makes me smile, actually, that it was a woman that first compiled this whole collection in English, because the Mabinogion had actually fallen out of favour and wasn't really, trendy to academics and historians to really study until very recently, until the 1800s. I'm sorry, I did my bachelor's in ancient history, so the 1800s, I still have to catch myself calling that modern. In some ways, calling it new, because obviously they were still written 150 plus years ago. So Lady Charlotte Guest was an English noblewoman who married a Welshman and moved to Merthyr Tydfil, which again makes me smile because my family are from Merthyr Tydfil, it's brilliant. So Lady Charlotte Guest became absolutely fascinated with the history and the culture and the folklore of Wales. She joined loads of history societies. She was really, really interested in the mythology of Wales, and she loved Wales so much and later claimed that, Wales was her country. So we really have to thank her for so much, for resurfacing these amazing mythic tales that would otherwise have just maybe been lost in a few magazines. As I've mentioned, the Mabinogion is medieval prose literature, and it's Welsh mythology essentially. It's concerning mythic Welsh characters. Now, there is some debate on exactly who these characters are, because when you read the Mabinogion, and there's a brilliant translation of it by Sioned Davies, and I absolutely recommend you read her translation. It's brilliant. But these characters are princesses and kings and princes and queens. But there is some debate on whether or not they are actually goddesses and gods, which is really interesting because there is a huge element of magical realism in the Mabinogion. There are things that are so fantastical and they're taken for granted. For example, I'm going to be focusing on the second branch, and that's why I said I'm going to be doing 4 episodes on the Mabinogion, maybe short episodes, but hopefully that means that I'll upload them much quicker than I've uploaded this one. And then when all that's done, I'll then upload my episode on the Irish Banshee. So hopefully that's something to look forward to. But as I was saying about magical realism, in the second branch of the Mabinogion, it concerns Bran the Blessed and his sister Branwen. But Bran the Blessed is a giant. He's the giant king of Britain. But it's never once really said that he's a giant. But there are things that are described that only a giant could do, and that's the only sort of indication you would have reading it, that he was a giant. Whereas obviously in oral performance and poetry, these things would have had hand gestures and all sorts of other indications of his size. But the fact that he is a giant is really kind of taken for granted. It's just a natural element of the story. So I'm basically just going to recount to you the second episode of the Mabinogion, the second branch. It's named after Branwen, so I suppose I'll just start at the beginning and hopefully my storytelling skills will carry me through. So the second branch of the Mabinogion begins with Bran the Blessed. He's with his family and they notice that ships are arriving from Ireland. And it turns out that I'm going to probably pronounce many of these names very wrong, and I'm very sorry about that. But the King of Ireland has come to visit Bran the Blessed, the giant king of Britain. And he's come to ask for Branwen, who is Bran the Blessed's sister. He's come to ask for her hand in marriage. Interestingly enough, Branwen's view and opinion are not really asked in this way, but we do know from Welsh medieval law texts that there are a number of ways that marriage could happen, and women could elope, they could run off. If you ran off and you were a virgin, your father could compel you to come back home. But if you eloped and you were not a virgin when you came back, or you ceased to be a virgin, your father could no longer compel you to come back home. And in 7 years, you would have all the same rights as any other married couple. So marriage in Wales, in the ancient Welsh law texts, is very interesting. So it seems that Branwen doesn't disagree with this. There is no mention of her not wanting to marry the King of Ireland. So Bran agrees and says, yes, you can marry my sister. And they have a great feast. So everything seems to be going brilliantly. And the Irish king, I'm just going to keep calling him the Irish king and hoping you realise it's not because I can't pronounce his name. Which of course is definitely the reason. But the Irish king and Branwen sleep together and they're married. So Efnisien, who is the half-brother of Branwen and Bran, is furious that no one has asked his opinion. He comes across the horses of the Irishmen, and when he finds out what has happened, like I said, he's furious, and in a prideful kind of rage, he mutilates the horses of the Irish. So he cuts off their ears, he cuts off their lips, their tails. He basically completely mutilates them and renders them useless, which is, of course, a truly violent and horrific thing to do, as was, completely acknowledged in the story. And the idea of insult and compensation is hugely, hugely important to Welsh society at this time. We can see in the ancient Welsh law texts, again, I'm going to reference them quite a bit because I've done quite a bit of reading on them. There is a huge, huge emphasis on insult and compensation. So the idea is, if you are insulted, you are absolutely in your rights to expect compensation for that insult. You are absolutely entitled to it. But when you have received your compensation or your reparations, that should be it. You should draw a line under whatever insult or grudges there are. You should not carry it any further than that. So, of course, the Irish are hugely, hugely insulted by this. Matholwich is absolutely horrified at the insult that has now been given to him. It's an awful, terrible thing for Efnisien to do. Bran the Blessed, he talks to Matholwch. Sorry, it took me a few times to get there. Matholwch. So Bran talks to Matholwch, and he's very apologetic. He understands that his brother has given him a grave insult and that he should be recompensed. He should receive his compensation, and that is only fair. He never tries to worm his way out of it. He is upfront and says, I will offer you this magical cauldron that can bring people back from the dead. But once they are brought back, they will be mute. So Matholwch, who is a king, obviously finds this a brilliant thing to have. I mean, he's a king with an army. Who doesn't want a magical item that can potentially bring fallen soldiers back from the dead? So perhaps this is a little bit of sly foreshadowing about what is to happen. So Matholwch takes Branwen and they go to Ireland and all seems well. They have a year when she has a son and they seem to have a really lovely year or two. The people love Branwen. They think that she's beautiful. They think that she's a lovely queen. But then after a year or so, Matholwch's advisors wiggle their way into his inner circle and say, oh, do you remember when Branwen's brother Efnisien mutilated your horses? That was quite bad, wasn't it? That was a nasty thing to do. And Matholwch goes, no, yes, you're right, actually. That was a terrible thing to do. And like I said earlier, once you've been insulted and you've been recompensed, you should draw a line under it. You shouldn't take that insult any further. But of course, that is what Matholwch does. Matholwch. I'm still slipping up, but there we go. That is what Matholwch does. He takes the insult further and he punishes Branwen, the sister of Bran the Blessed and the sister of Efnisien. So he punishes her by sending her to the kitchen, and basically the butcher is to sort of smack her around the ear every single day. And of course, this is a princess. This is a noble woman, a woman that has never sort of been subjugated to this kind of humiliation before. She has done nothing wrong whatsoever. It was, of course, her brother who committed the violent act against Matholwch and his horses and his people. But Branwen is the one that is punished. But she doesn't sit idly by. In the long days in the kitchen, she trains up a bird to carry a message across the ocean to her brother to tell him of her distress. So that is exactly what she does. She trains a bird to carry a message. And of course, birds do not speak the human tongue, even in this story, as far as I'm aware. So she trains the bird to obviously send a written message. So she must tie a note or a letter onto its leg or something like that. That's what I assume happens. Of course, these tales, even in the medieval period, would have still been performed orally, because not everyone in the medieval period was literate. So the whole reading of Branwen's letter might have been an integral part of this episode. Bran reading out loud what his sister has been put through. And obviously, like any good big brother, he travels across the ocean to defend his sister's honour. And this is actually the main indication that I got when I was first reading it, that Bran is actually a giant. Because whilst his people are sailing beside him, he is walking right through the ocean. Obviously with his head and shoulders and everything still above water. So imagine this wonderful image of this giant stomping across the ocean from Wales to Ireland to avenge his sister. And Matholwch sees this, of course. He sees this giant and his men approaching. And what does he do? He runs to another sort of secluded island, off of Ireland. And he thinks, we'll cut down the bridge so they can never get across. But of course, Bran uses his own body, the body of a giant, to act as a bridge between the two lands so they can meet Matholwch. Matholwch. There we go. Still slipping up. I'll get there in the end. So he uses his body and his soldiers travel across him and they meet Matholwch and his men. So they say, what is happening? This is awful. What have you done to my sister? We compensated you for the insult paid to you. You should have drawn a line underneath it all. So Matholwch talks to his council again and they say, okay, we will pretend to offer him compensation for the insult that we have now done to him. So what we do is we will build a house for Bran because he's a giant and he has never had a house to sit in and to rest in before because he's too large to fit into any house. But they didn't end it there. They thought, we'll put 100 pillars in this house, and on every single pillar we'll put a sack, and in every sack we'll have a soldier. So that is what happens. They tell Bran, and he accepts this. He accepts if they build him a house, for he's never been inside a house. He's never had a house really to rest in. If they build him a house, then he will forgive them because that will be the compensation to the insult paid to him. So I think Bran is quite a straightforward character, really. He doesn't seem deceitful or deceptive or anything like this, unlike his brother and unlike Matholwch. So Matholwch and his men, they build this house, but Bran doesn't step foot into the house first. It's actually Efnisien. So Efnisien, he walks into the house and he comes across the first sack, and an Irish soldier or guard is stood there. And he asks the Irish guard, "What is in this bag?" And the Irish guard replies, "Flour, friend." Now, in the written down version of this tale, it's a rule of 3. So Ethnician asks 3 times, "What is in this bag?" And the Irish guard replies, "Flour, friend." But of course, we know that he asked for every single one, so he would have asked 100 times. And each time, Ethnician puts a hand into the bag of flour, feels the soldier's head. Of course, there are soldiers hiding in each of these bags, and he crushes the head in the helmet. So this is what I mentioned about foreshadowing earlier, because obviously when all these 100 soldiers are now killed by Ethnician, who at this period is still being violent and sort of horrible, but he's doing it for his family. So he crushes the head of 100 of these soldiers, and Matholwch and his men can't really do anything about it at the moment because that would call to attention their trickery. So there is another feast, obviously in the Great Hall, and Gwern, who is the son of Branwen and the son of Matholwch, is there, and I think he's only a baby really. And Ethnician, he sort of claims, "Forgive me for what I'm about to do," and he takes Gwern, which is obviously his nephew, and he throws him into the fire. And of course, he kills this child because he still feels insulted and he still feels angry. So he's a truly unpleasant character. But a huge, huge battle ensues between the two armies, between the army of Ireland and between the army of Wales. And obviously Matholwch has this magical cauldron. So he is bringing back his slain soldiers again and again and again. Ethnician realises what is happening and he hides among the bodies and the corpses, and then he is flung into the cauldron and he stretches out his body and breaks the cauldron apart, rendering it useless, completely destroying it, and also sacrificing himself in the process. So he is a very interesting character because he is not really an archetypal trickster character, although he is spontaneous and he is unpredictable and he is violent, but there is no amusement and underlying humour in his actions. His actions are very dark, they're very violent, but in the end he does sacrifice himself to help his brother and to help his country. So he's quite a hard character to pinpoint, really. So a huge battle ensues, like I said, and everyone but 7 people are slain, and 7 people on the Welsh side. So it's 7 soldiers, and at Bran's behest, they cut off his head, which can still talk. They're still amused by his head, which is still talking to them, still conversing with them. And they go back to Harlech, where they originally came from. And they reside there quite peacefully for 7 years. They're still enjoying the company of Bran's decapitated giant head. He's still talking to them, still conversing with them. And then they move to Wales for 80 years, where they never age. They never feel time passing. So they're there for 80 years until one of the soldiers opens up a door which is facing Cornwall. There are 2 doors. I think there's one facing Wales and one facing Cornwall. That might be slightly wrong, but it's definitely the door facing Cornwall that he opens. And then because of this, they feel the grief of what happened all those years ago. Because to them it's been many, many years, but it all comes flooding back and they feel the grief. And now the head of Bran the Blessed is silent. He had instructed them prior to this to take his head and leave it in London. So his head basically is in London facing France to ward off invaders. So it really is quite a humorous image, actually, of this giant head frightening away invaders from France. So that essentially concludes the story of Branwen. Branwen, other than her training the birds to call to arms her brother, doesn't really have an instrumental role in the story. So I would really like to see maybe an adaptation of this story one day as a film or as TV in which she has a much more assertive role, because I think that would be quite fascinating to see. But essentially, Branwen dies of heartache, actually. She sees what's happened to Ireland and happened to Wales, these two lands that have just been completely destroyed, and she blames herself for it and dies of heartbreak. Of course, it wasn't her fault whatsoever. It was her brother's fault. And there actually is a point when Branwen offers counsel to her own brother and urges him to accept Matholwch's apology. So Branwen, much like her brother Bran, seems very level-headed and seems quite calm until obviously her son is thrown onto the fire and there's these two armies that completely decimate each other. There is a little bit of a jab, a little bit of a cruel joke on the expense of the Irish at the end of this tale. Obviously, by no means I am not looking to insult any Irish people at all. The story, the second branch of the Mabinogion, is obviously from the Welsh perspective at the time. So there was obviously a little jab at the Irish at the end, which says that only 5 pregnant women were left, and those pregnant women gave birth to 5 sons, and those 5 sons then have sex with each other's mothers to then repopulate the island. And then you have 5 districts or 4 districts of Ireland, which are then separated, which makes sense of those different districts, but also is taking a bit of a mick of the Irish there. And I'm sorry to any Irish listeners about that. It's not my intention to mock you at all. So that is the second branch of the Mabinogion. I hope you have enjoyed my storytelling. It's probably worth mentioning again some more important factors of Welsh society at the time. Like I mentioned about insult and recompense, friendship was also a hugely important theme at the time. So this idea that Matholwch could not forgive and he could not befriend is really the downfall. And it's been quite debated whether there is a moral code hidden underneath these mythic tales of the Mabinogion. And I think there is, because there is lots of references to concepts that are very prevalent in the ancient Welsh law texts. And I definitely think that there is a moral code that would have been understood by the audience at the time. It's also worth pointing out that these are onomastic tales, which means orally performed originally, so they would have explained the landscapes around them, which is something we don't quite get when we read them in their written down form. But that's really all I have to say on that branch, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. Again, thank you so much to anyone who has listened to this episode and anyone who has listened to episode 1 and sent me any kind of feedback. There is a Twitter page and a Facebook page for this podcast, obviously under the name The Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast. I'm on Libsyn. So that's the website that this podcast is hosted on. You might be listening to it from there anyway. And you can also listen to it on SoundCloud, and you can listen to it on iTunes as well. If you do listen to it on iTunes, please give me a rating and a review. It's so appreciated. The email address for this podcast is celticmythspodcast@outlook.com. And if you ever want to get into contact with me about any of the topics, if you want to request a certain topic, if you just want to discuss things in a little bit more depth, I'm very, very happy to do that. I obviously love what I'm talking about, so I would love to discuss it further. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I will be uploading 3 more episodes on the Mabinogion as pertaining to the 3 other branches, and then I will upload the episode on banshees. Hopefully upload it in a much quicker than I uploaded this one. Again, sorry about that, I had lots of uni work to do, but see you next time then.